In 1891, the President of the United States stood in front of Congress and read out a body count. 369 brakemen killed in a single year. 7,841 maimed. Not from war, from coupling train cars by hand. You've stood on a railroad platform. You've watched freight cars roll by, boxcar after boxcar, and thought nothing of it. But for the better part of a century, the space between those cars was one of the deadliest places to stand in American industry, deadlier, mile for mile, than working the coal seams of Appalachia. Most people assume railroad work was simply hard, honest labor, long hours, low pay, a hard hat, and a whistle. But the actual death toll, the actual math the railroads ran on human bodies, was kept quiet for decades because publishing it would have forced Congress to act. Sit with us here and we'll walk you through the wage sheets, the strike reports, and the government records, from Bureau of Labor Statistics data to first-hand congressional testimony that the industry never wanted printed on a plaque. By the end, you'll never look at a train car the same way again. Number 25, the coupling pin. For most of the 1800s, American railcars connected using something called a link and pin coupler, an iron loop that had to be guided into a socket by hand, then locked in place with a metal pin dropped in at the exact right instant, while the cars were still moving toward each other. There was no way to do this from outside the cars. A brakeman had to stand between two multi-ton steel frames as they closed like a mouth, judge the timing by eye, and pull his hand back in time. Thousands did not. Fingers, hands, whole arms were left on the tracks. Therefore, an entire generation of railroad men could be identified at a glance by their missing fingers. Old-timers called them railroaders' handshake injuries, because so many men in the trade had at least one. But losing fingers was the good outcome. Number 24. The numbers Congress finally couldn't ignore. In his 1891 annual message, President Benjamin Harrison told Congress that in a single year, 369 brakemen had been killed and 7,841 maimed doing nothing but coupling cars, and that across all railroad jobs, 2,451 workers died and 22,890 were injured that year alone. He called it a cruel and largely a needless sacrifice. Congress had been warned since the 1870s. It still took until 1893 to pass the Railroad Safety Appliance Act, forcing companies to install the automatic knuckle coupler that a former Confederate officer named Eli Janney had already patented back in 1873. The technology to stop the bleeding had existed for 20 years. The railroads simply hadn't wanted to pay for it. That single decision, cutting corners on a piece of steel the size of a boot, explains almost everything else you're about to hear, because it reveals how this industry actually made its choices. But the men on the coupling deck weren't even the most expendable workers on the line. Number 23, 1 in 117. That was a working railroad man's odds of dying on the job in the late 1800s, according to historical safety data. In the running trades, the men actually riding trains, not just working the yards, 1 in 12 was injured every single year. Congressman Henry Cabot Lodge said in 1892 that railroad workers suffer as if they were fighting a war. He wasn't exaggerating for effect. He was comparing casualty rates. Number 22, American railroads were built cheap on purpose. Unlike Britain's densely packed, heavily signaled rail network, American lines crossed vast, sparsely populated distances, and companies economized by skimping on both signals and construction quality. Fewer signals meant more collisions and derailments. It wasn't recklessness by individual workers causing most of these deaths. It was a business model that treated infrastructure investment as optional and treated the workforce as the cheaper alternative to spending money. But the workforce wasn't just cheap. In some cases, it was chosen because it could be paid less and protest less. And that brings us to a chapter of railroad history most textbooks compress into a single sentence. Number 21, the Central Pacific Railroad's workforce, laying track east from Sacramento through the Sierra Nevada in the 1860s, was more than 90% Chinese immigrant labor by 1867, somewhere between 10 and 20,000 men. They were paid roughly $10 to $15 less per month than white laborers doing the same work. And unlike other crews, they were not given company food or lodging in rail cars. They provided their own tents, their own rice, their own dried seafood, hauled in on their own backs. Number 20. Some of that work meant being lowered off sheer granite cliffs in hand-woven baskets to drill holes and plant black powder charges, then signaling to be hauled back up before the fuse reached the rock. Get pulled up a few seconds too slow, and you didn't get pulled up at all. Number 19. The winter of 1866 into 1867 buried entire work camps. 3,000 laborers lived and worked through the Sierra Nevada winter in snowdrifts reported at 40 feet deep, with avalanches burying tunnels, tents, and men without warning. Historians estimate that somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 Chinese workers died building the Central Pacific stretch of the transcontinental line, from explosions, avalanches, rock slides, and exposure. The exact figure is disputed, since the Central Pacific kept few records of individual Chinese deaths. Many families back in China never learned exactly how their sons died. Over 1,000 sets of remains were eventually shipped home for burial, because that was often the only accounting anyone gave them. That kind of silence usually means a workforce with no leverage. Therefore, it's easy to assume these men simply endured it. They didn't. Number 18. In June 1867, roughly 3,000 Chinese laborers along a 30-mile stretch of track walked off the job at once, demanding wages equal to their Irish counterparts and a shorter workday, according to labor historians, one of the largest labor strikes in the country up to that point. The Central Pacific's response wasn't negotiation. It was a supply blockade, cutting off the food and provisions the strikers had to buy themselves until hunger forced them back to work within about a week. Number 17. When the Golden Spike ceremony celebrated the railroad's completion at Promontory Point in May 1869, the Chinese workers who had built most of the western half of the line were largely absent from the festivities and the famous photographs. It took roughly a century before any public monument acknowledged their labor at all. But it wasn't only the men laying track who fought back against a system built to spend them cheaply. Number 16. On July 16, 1877, Baltimore and Ohio railroad workers in Martinsburg, West Virginia, responded to a 10% wage cut, the second cut that year, by uncoupling the locomotives and refusing to let a single train leave the yard. The strike spread within days to Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and St. Louis, eventually pulling in more than 100,000 workers and stopping more than half the freight moving in the entire country. Number 15. In Pittsburgh, the local militia sent to break the strike refused to fire on the crowd. Many of the guardsmen were railroad workers themselves or had brothers and fathers on the line. President Rutherford B. Hayes sent federal troops instead. The official death toll in Pittsburgh alone was recorded at 26, though historians believe the real number was higher, and strikers burned roughly 40 buildings, including the city's Union Railway depot, in the chaos that followed. Number 14. In Reading, Pennsylvania, soldiers opened fire on a crowd that had gathered simply to watch the strikers, not attack anyone, killing around 10 bystanders. By the time the 6-week strike wave finally ended in early August 1877, roughly 100 people were dead nationwide. The workers did not get their wages restored. That is the cost of demanding fair pay on the tracks. But there was a second railroad workforce built almost entirely on the assumption that it would never dare to demand anything at all. Number 13. Starting in 1867, the Pullman Company, which built and operated the country's luxury sleeping cars, began hiring almost exclusively black men, many of them recently freed from slavery, as porters. Historians say Pullman deliberately sought out formerly enslaved men, believing they would offer the deference he wanted his passengers to feel. It became one of the largest employers of black labor in the country, and one of the most tightly controlled. Number 12. Porters were required to work roughly 400 hours a month to earn a full paycheck, and much of their actual income was expected to come from passenger tips rather than wages, meaning their pay depended on staying agreeable to the very people the company had hired them to serve. Number 11. By 1925, Pullman porters were earning around $810 a year, about $11,875 in inflation-adjusted terms today, for that punishing schedule. When they organized and asked for a living wage in a socialist magazine called The Messenger, it took the involvement of a non-employee organizer, a Philip Randolph, precisely because any actual porter who spoke up risked being fired on the spot. Number 10. The era's biggest railroad union, the American Railway Union. The same union that would soon lead a national strike against Pullman itself, explicitly excluded black porters from membership, meaning the men with arguably the least power on the entire railroad system couldn't even join the organizations built to fight for railroad workers. Number 9. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the union porters built for themselves, was not recognized by Pullman until 1937, 12 years after its founding, and 70 years after the company started hiring black porters in the first place. When the contract finally landed, it cut the required work month from around 400 hours down to a 240-hour cap, and became the first agreement ever signed between a major American corporation and a black-led union. But wages and hours were only half the fight. The other half was simply staying alive on shift, and that job never stopped being lethal even after the couplers got safer. Number 8. Railroads were dangerous enough, this early and this consistently, that companies began employing their own private railway surgeons. Doctors kept on retainer specifically because injuries happened so routinely that waiting for a local physician cost the company too much downtime. It was, in a strange way, one of the earliest forms of employer-sponsored medical coverage in America, built not out of concern for workers, but because broken men were bad for the timetable. Number 7. Brakemen didn't just work between cars, they worked on top of them. Before automatic air brakes became standard, a brakeman's job during a stop meant running along the roofs of moving freight cars, in the dark, in rain, in ice, cranking a handwheel on each car to slow the train car by car. One slick board, one gust of wind, and there was nothing between him and the railbed below. Number 6. Even the clock on your wall owes a debt to this industry's death toll, sort of. Before November 18, 1883, American towns each ran on their own local solar time, which made railroad scheduling a genuine safety hazard, since two trains could be running on two different official times on the same stretch of track. The railroads themselves, not the federal government, imposed the 4 standard time zones we still use today, specifically to reduce the scheduling confusion that had been killing people. Number 5. The government eventually started counting the dead in a way that could not be buried in a company ledger. Federal fatal injury data from 1992 to 1998, decades after knuckle couplers, air brakes and safety laws had supposedly fixed the industry, still showed rail transportation workers dying at more than twice the national average rate for all occupations, with conductors, brakemen and switch operators bearing the largest share. Number 4. Many of the men who did survive the line lived in towns the railroad itself owned, company towns, like the one George Pullman built outside Chicago, where workers paid rent to the same company that cut their paychecks, and a wage cut could mean falling behind on housing owned by your own employer. Number 3. Track building did not stop being forced labor once slavery officially ended. After the Civil War, Southern states leased convicts, disproportionately black men, often arrested under vagrancy laws written specifically to criminalize freedom, to private railroad companies for pennies a day. Companies that did not own the workers had no financial reason to keep them alive. According to an 1881 investigative report, the death rate in convict camps working Virginia's Richmond and Allegheny Railroad ran 7 times higher than the death rate inside the state penitentiary. In South Carolina, convicts leased to the Greenwood and Augusta Railroad died at a documented rate of roughly 45% a year between 1877 and 1879. Number 2. It took a Confederate officer's coupler patent sitting unused for 20 years, a presidential address naming the dead by the thousand, and a 50-year-old union movement led by men who couldn't join the existing unions to drag this industry, kicking and only after Congress forced it into treating its workforce as something other than replaceable. Number 1, and the one worth remembering. Every time you watch a freight train roll through a crossing today, quiet, automatic, nobody standing between the cars, you're looking at a piece of machinery bought with a body count nobody wanted printed. The steel coupler that connects those cars did more to save American railroad workers than any speech ever did, and it sat on a patent desk for 2 decades because saving those lives simply cost more than losing them. That's the real story of the American railroad, not the golden spike, not the whistle in the night, but the ledger nobody wanted you to see. Next time you're stopped at a crossing, watching a mile of freight cars roll by uncoupled by human hands, remember, somebody's fingers bought you that weight.